No one in Redwood State Prison ever saw the first move, but everyone remembered the silence that followed. The security camera above the cafeteria door captured the aftermath in cold, grainy detail, for inmates down, trays scattered across the concrete floor, and right in the center of it all stood a man who didn't look like he belonged in that moment at all. Daniel Wu wasn't breathing hard, wasn't looking around, wasn't even tense. He just stood there like nothing had happened, like the chaos around him didn't register. Guards would later replay that footage over and over again, slowing it down, frame by frame, searching for something they could explain, but there was always a gap, a moment where everything changed and no one could quite see how. But to understand what really happened in that cafeteria, you have to go back exactly 2 hours earlier, when the room was loud, crowded, and ruled by a very different kind of order. Redwood's D block wasn't just another section of the prison, it was a territory, and everyone inside knew who controlled it. Jason Miller stood near the center. Tables like he always did, 6'3", built like a wall, surrounded by men who laughed a little louder when he spoke and moved a little quicker when he looked their way. People didn't challenge Jason, not because they were told not to, but because they understood what happened when someone forgot their place. The noise in the cafeteria shifted the moment Daniel Wu walked in, not because he did anything to draw attention, but because he didn't. He moved quietly, almost too quietly, carrying his tray with both hands, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady but not confrontational. He looked smaller than most of the men in that room, lean, composed, like someone who had learned how to exist without taking up space, and in a place like Redwood, that kind of presence didn't go unnoticed. It invited attention. Jason saw him before anyone else did, his smirk forming before a single word was spoken, because in his world, someone like Daniel was easy to read, easy to test, easy to break. A few of the men around him leaned in, already sensing entertainment, already waiting for the moment things would shift. Daniel kept walking, step by step, as if the tension building in the room had nothing to do with him. As if he hadn't just stepped into a situation that everyone else could feel tightening like a coiled spring, and that was the first thing that didn't make sense. Not to Jason, not to the others, and not to the few inmates who had been around long enough to recognize when something felt different, because in a place built on reactions, on dominance, on visible fear, Daniel Wu gave them nothing at all. And sometimes, in a place like that, silence is the most dangerous thing of all. Jason Miller did not move right away, and that alone was enough to make the men around him shift uneasily, because hesitation was not something they associated with him. He studied Daniel for a moment longer than usual, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to give him an easy answer. Then he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until he stood directly in Daniel's path. The cafeteria noise faded again, not completely, but enough that conversations turned into murmurs. Trays paused mid-air, and attention quietly redirected toward the center of the room. Daniel stopped walking, not because he was forced to, but because the path ahead of him had simply closed, his posture unchanged, his hand steady on the tray, his expression unreadable. Jason tilted his head slightly, a faint smile returning to his face, the kind that usually came right before he reminded someone how things worked in that block. "You lost?" he asked, his voice low but carrying far enough for nearby tables to hear, and a few chuckles followed, quick and automatic. Daniel looked at him, not up in fear, not down in submission, but straight ahead, calm, almost detached, as if he were listening more than reacting. That was the second thing that did not make sense, and Jason felt it even if he could not explain it. Most men either avoided his eyes or challenged him with something loud and reckless, but this was neither. This was stillness, and stillness did not fit into the rules Jason understood. One of the men behind him muttered something under his breath, something meant to provoke, and another laughed louder this time, trying to push the moment back into familiar territory. Jason reached out and tapped the edge of Daniel's tray, not hard, just enough to disrupt the balance, to test for a reaction. To see if this quiet man would finally show something real. The tray shifted slightly, but Daniel adjusted without effort, his grip tightening just enough to keep everything steady, his breathing unchanged, slow and controlled, like someone who had practiced it for years. A few of the older inmates noticed the detail, the rhythm of his breath, the way his shoulders stayed loose instead of tensing, and they exchanged brief glances without saying a word. Jason noticed something too, though he could not name it, a sense that the moment was not unfolding the way it usually did, that he was not fully in control of it. So he pushed further, stepping closer, his presence filling the space, his voice rising just enough to reclaim attention, throwing out another remark meant to draw a reaction, to force Daniel into the role everyone expected him to play. But Daniel did not take the role, he did not respond the way the room demanded. He simply stood there, looking at Jason as if he were measuring something invisible, something deeper than words or gestures, and that was when the atmosphere shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the air just before a storm, when everything feels heavier without anyone knowing exactly why, because in a place built on predictable patterns, Daniel Wu had just broken the first rule, and no one in that cafeteria yet understood what that would cost. Jason had built his reputation on one simple truth that everyone in D Block understood without needing it explained: if you push someone far enough they would eventually reveal who they really were, and once that happened the outcome was always predictable: fear, anger, desperation. It did not matter which one surfaced first, they all led to the same result, and Jason had spent years proving that pattern over and over again. But standing in front of Daniel Wu, that pattern refused to appear. And the longer it did not, the more it unsettled him in ways he did not show. He shifted his weight slightly, closing the distance just enough to make the pressure undeniable, his shadow stretching across Daniel's chest, waiting for the subtle signs he was used to reading: a tightening jaw, a quick breath, a flicker in the eyes, anything that would confirm control. But Daniel's breathing remained steady, slow and measured, like someone counting time in a place where time no longer mattered, and his eyes did not dart or drop. They stayed exactly where they were, calm, observant, as if Jason were just another detail in the room rather than the center of it. That was when a faint ripple moved through the nearby tables, not loud enough to draw attention from across the cafeteria, but enough that those closest could feel it. A quiet awareness that something about this moment was different from every other confrontation they had witnessed in that space. One of the older inmates leaned back slightly, his tray untouched, watching with a focus that suggested recognition rather than curiosity, as if he had seen something like this before, somewhere far removed from concrete walls and steel bars. Jason spoke again, his tone sharper now, not louder, but edged with something that hinted at impatience, pushing for a response that still did not come. Daniel finally moved. But not in the way anyone expected. He adjusted his stance by a fraction of an inch, shifting his weight so subtly that most people would not have noticed, except for the few who understood how balance worked beyond simple posture. His hands remained on the tray, but his fingers relaxed, not tightening, not defensive, just present, like someone who had already accounted for everything around him. Jason's smile faded for a split second before returning, but this time it did not carry the same certainty, because somewhere beneath the surface, something had begun to feel off. Not wrong in a way he could point to, but wrong in a way he could feel. The men behind him sensed it too, their laughter quieter now, their movements less exaggerated, as if they were waiting for something they could not yet name. Daniel's gaze never wavered, and in that stillness there was a kind of clarity that did not belong in a place like Redwood, a sense that whatever was about to happen had already been decided long before this moment began, and for the first time in a very long time. Jason Miller found himself standing in front of someone he could not read, and in a world where reading people was everything, that uncertainty was the most dangerous thing in the room. Jason's instincts told him to end it quickly, to force the moment back into something simple, something he controlled, but instincts only work when the situation follows familiar rules, and this one did not. He took another step forward, close enough now that most men would have leaned back without thinking, close enough that the space between them felt like a line being drawn rather than distance being closed, and still Daniel did not move away. The cafeteria had gone quieter again, not completely silent, but muted in a way that made every small sound stand out: the scrape of a chair, the clink of a fork against a tray, the low hum of something building beneath the surface. Jason reached out again, this time not to test but to provoke, to disrupt the stillness that was beginning to feel like defiance, his hand brushing against Daniel's tray just enough to tilt it off balance. The food shifted, a cup rolled slightly, but before anything could fall, Daniel adjusted with a motion so small it almost did not exist, his wrist turning, his center shifting, everything returning to stillness as if the disruption had never happened. A few heads turned more sharply now, not because of what Jason had done, but because of how easily it had been absorbed. Jason saw it too, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind his eyes, not fear, but something closer to awareness, like a realization forming without permission. He straightened slightly, his voice rising just enough to reclaim control, throwing out another remark, sharper this time, designed to cut through the calm and force a reaction, but the words landed without impact, like they had nowhere to stick. Daniel's expression did not change, but there was a shift, subtle and almost invisible, the kind of shift that only showed itself if you were looking for it. His breathing slowed even further, his shoulders settling into a deeper kind of stillness, as if everything around him had just been measured and accounted for. One of the older inmates exhaled slowly, shaking his head just enough that the man beside him noticed, a silent signal that something important was being missed by everyone else. Jason took another half step forward, his presence filling the space completely now, expecting the moment to break, expecting Daniel to finally react, because that was how this always ended. But instead of breaking, the moment tightened, like a wire pulled too far, and for the first time, Jason felt it. Not in his thoughts, but somewhere deeper, a sense that he was no longer setting the pace of what was happening. Daniel's eyes remained steady, but now there was something else behind them. Not anger, not fear, but focus, the kind of focus that did not belong in a cafeteria filled with noise and tension, the kind of focus that suggested everything happening right now was only the surface of something much larger. And as the air in the room grew heavier, as the noise faded into something distant and irrelevant, it became clear to the few who were paying attention that whatever came next was not going to follow the rules that had governed this place for years. Jason Miller had built his control on certainty, on knowing exactly how far he could push before someone broke, but that certainty was slipping now, not all at once, not in a way anyone could point to, but in small, quiet cracks that only he could feel. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, reminding himself that this was still his block, his room, his rules, and that nothing about the man in front of him should change that. The men behind him shifted slightly, waiting, watching, expecting the moment to resolve the way it always did, because in Redwood, patterns were everything, and patterns kept order. Jason reached forward again, this time not testing, not probing, but asserting, his hand moving with more intention, more presence, aiming to disrupt the calm that had overstayed its welcome. But before that intention could fully land, Daniel moved, not fast, not dramatic, just precise, his tray lowering smoothly onto the table beside him as if he had already decided. This exact moment would come. The motion was controlled, deliberate, and completely unhurried, and that alone caused a ripple through the nearby tables, because it felt less like a reaction and more like preparation. Daniel's hands came away from the tray and rested naturally at his sides, his posture unchanged, his breathing still slow and even, like someone stepping into a space he understood far better than anyone else in that room. Jason noticed the shift immediately, and for the first time. He hesitated in a way he could not hide, just a fraction of a second, but enough for those closest to him to see. Daniel was no longer holding anything, no longer occupied, and yet there was no tension in him, no visible readiness, just a quiet alignment, as if every part of him had settled into place. One of the older inmates leaned forward slightly now, his eyes narrowing, recognizing something that had been building since the moment Daniel walked in, something that did not belong to this environment but had somehow found its way into it. Jason spoke again, louder this time, trying to reclaim the space, to remind everyone, including himself, that he was still in control, but the words felt thinner now, less grounded, like they were echoing rather than landing. Daniel finally responded, not with words, but with presence, his gaze lifting just slightly, meeting Jason's fully for the first time, and in that moment, something shifted in a way that no one could ignore. It was not aggression, not challenge, but clarity, a calm certainty that did not ask for permission and did not seek approval. The room seemed to tighten around them. Conversations fading entirely now, every eye drawn to the center without anyone needing to say a word. Jason felt it then, unmistakable, the realization that whatever came next was no longer something he could predict, and in a place where prediction was power, that loss mattered more than anything else. Daniel stood there, still as ever, but no longer passive, no longer part of the background, and for the first time since the moment began, it was clear that the balance had shifted, not loudly, not violently, but completely, and no one in that cafeteria yet understood just how far that shift was about to go. The moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough that even the guards at the far end of the cafeteria began to notice the shift in atmosphere, their conversations slowing as their attention drifted toward the center of the room where something unspoken was unfolding. Jason Miller felt every second of it, felt the weight of eyes on his back, the expectation pressing in from all sides, and in that pressure, he made a decision, not calculated, not controlled, but instinctive, the kind of decision that came from years of never backing down. He stepped forward fully now, closing the last inch of space between them, his presence overwhelming, his voice cutting through the silence as he spoke again, louder, sharper, demanding a response that would restore the balance he had lost. But Daniel did not answer the way Jason expected. He did not raise his voice, did not step back, did not react with anger or fear. Instead, he did something far simpler, and far more unsettling. He took a single, slow breath. It was subtle, almost invisible, but for those watching closely, it changed everything, because that breath was not hesitation, it was intention. His shoulders lowered slightly, his posture aligning with a kind of precision that did not belong to instinct but to discipline, years of it, practiced and refined in places far removed from concrete walls and steel tables. Jason felt it without understanding it, a shift in the air that made his next movement feel heavier than it should have, like he was stepping into something he could not see. Daniel's eyes remained steady, but now there was a depth to them, not cold, not hostile, just focused in a way that suggested nothing in that room was happening by chance anymore. One of the older inmates leaned back fully now, his tray forgotten, his attention locked in, because he recognized what others did not, that this was no longer a confrontation, it was a transition, a moment where control had already changed hands, even if no one had acknowledged it yet. Jason moved again, faster this time, trying to force the moment into action, to reclaim the rhythm he had lost. But the space between them did not behave the way it should have. It shifted, subtly but decisively, as if Daniel had anticipated the exact timing, the exact angle, the exact intention behind it. There was no sudden burst, no dramatic display, just a sequence of movements so efficient they almost disappeared, and in the span of a second, the balance that had defined Jason's world for years unraveled. The men behind him stepped back instinctively, not because they saw everything clearly, but because they felt it, the sudden absence of certainty, the quiet collapse of something they had relied on without question. And when the motion ended, when the room settled into a silence deeper than before, Daniel Wu stood exactly where he had been, calm, composed, unchanged, while everything around him had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And in that silence, every person in that cafeteria understood one thing, even if they could not yet explain it: the rules of this place had just been rewritten. For a few seconds, no one moved, not the inmates, not the guards, not even the men who had been standing closest to Jason Miller just moments before, because what had just happened did not fit into anything they understood. It was not loud, it was not chaotic, it did not explode into the kind of scene people in Redwood were used to. Instead it ended in stillness, a kind of silence that felt heavier than any noise. Daniel Wu stood in the same place, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, as if the last few seconds had required no effort at all, as if he had simply stepped through something that everyone else had failed to see. Jason was no longer the center of the room, and that realization spread faster than any words could have, moving from table to table, from glance to glance, until the entire cafeteria felt it. The men who had stood behind Jason instinctively took a step back, not out of fear they could explain, but because something in their instincts told them the situation had shifted beyond their control. One of the guards near the entrance straightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to piece together what he had just witnessed, but even he could not find a clear answer, only fragments, a movement too fast to follow, a moment that seemed to disappear the more he focused on it. Daniel did not look around, did not acknowledge the attention, he simply adjusted his stance slightly, the smallest shift of weight, as if returning to a neutral position after completing something routine. That was what unsettled people the most, not what he had done, but how little it seemed to affect him. Across the room, the older inmate who had been watching from the beginning let out a slow breath, almost like a confirmation of something he had suspected all along, his eyes fixed on Daniel with a recognition that others did not yet share. Jason's absence from the center of attention created a vacuum, and in a place like Redwood, vacuums did not last long. Something always filled them, but this time, no one stepped forward. No one tried to reclaim the moment, because no one understood the rules anymore. Daniel finally moved, not away from the scene, not in retreat, but simply to the side, picking up his tray with the same calm precision he had shown before, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a pause in his routine. That simple act sent another ripple through the room, because it confirmed what many were beginning to realize, that whatever had just happened was not an accident, not luck, not something that could be repeated or challenged easily. The guards began to move in then, slower than usual, more cautious, their presence restoring a surface-level order that did not reach beneath the tension still hanging in the air. And as the noise of the cafeteria slowly returned, as conversations restarted in quieter tones, one thought lingered in every corner of the room, unspoken but undeniable: the man they had all overlooked had just changed something fundamental, and no one knew what would happen next. The story did not stay inside the cafeteria for long, because in a place like Redwood, nothing ever did. By the time the next count was called, the details had already begun to spread, not as clear facts, but as fragments, whispers moving through corridors, carried from one block to another, each retelling sharpening the mystery instead of clarifying it. Some said Daniel Wu had not moved at all, that the others had simply fallen away from him as if they had misjudged something invisible. Others claimed there had been a single motion so fast it could not be followed, a shift that changed everything in less than a second. The guards had their own version, quieter, more cautious, describing what they saw on the security footage, the strange gap where the sequence did not quite line up, the way the moment seemed to skip forward without explanation. But the most important version came from the few who had been close enough to feel it, the ones who understood that what happened was not about speed or strength, but control, a level of control that did not belong in a place built on chaos. Daniel did not participate in any of these conversations, he did not correct the stories or react to them, he simply returned to his routine, moving through the block with the same quiet presence he had shown before, but now that presence carried a weight that could not be ignored. Men who would have brushed past him before now stepped aside without thinking. Conversations paused when he entered a room, not out of fear but out of uncertainty, because no one could place him within the rules they understood. Even the guards watched him differently, not openly, but with a subtle awareness that suggested they were trying to understand something they could not quite define. Jason Miller remained in the background of those conversations, his name still carrying influence, but no longer unquestioned. Because something had changed in the hierarchy, something that could not be reversed by force or reputation alone. The older inmate who had observed everything from the beginning sat quietly at his usual table later that evening, speaking only once to the man beside him, his voice low, almost reflective, saying that what they had seen was not new, just rare, something that had been practiced for generations in places far removed from prison walls, something built on discipline rather than dominance. The man beside him did not fully understand, but he nodded anyway, because the explanation, even if incomplete, felt closer to the truth than anything else he had heard. Daniel continued walking through the block that night, his steps measured, his gaze steady, as if nothing around him had changed, but in reality, everything had. And as the lights dimmed and the noise of the prison settled into its usual rhythm, one question remained in the minds of those who had witnessed that moment, not what Daniel Wu had done, but who he really was, and how long he had been hiding it in plain sight. By the time night settled fully over Redwood State Prison, the story had already taken on a life of its own, growing beyond the cafeteria, beyond the people who had witnessed it, becoming something larger, something that no longer belonged to a single moment but to the entire system that thrived on control and hierarchy. Daniel Wu moved through that system and changed on the surface, his steps measured, his presence quiet. But everywhere he went, the atmosphere adjusted around him in ways that could not be ignored. Conversations lowered, eyes followed, and even those who prided themselves on indifference found themselves paying attention without understanding why. Jason Miller remained in his usual territory, but the space around him felt different now, not empty, not weak, but uncertain, like something foundational had shifted beneath his feet without warning, and for the first time in years, he did not immediately act to reclaim it, because instinct alone was no longer enough. The guards reviewed the footage again that night, replaying the same few seconds over and over, searching for clarity, for a sequence they could explain in reports and logs. But every time they reached the critical moment, it slipped through their understanding, not missing, not hidden, just beyond what they expected to see. One of them finally leaned back, exhaling slowly, and said that whatever it was, it had been deliberate, and that was the part that mattered most. Across the block, the older inmate sat in silence for a long time before speaking again, his voice low, almost reflective, explaining that discipline like that did not come from anger or instinct, it came from years of training, from a place where control was not forced on others but mastered within oneself. And that once someone reached that level, they did not need to prove anything, because the proof revealed itself when it had to. The man listening to him asked a simple question, one that had been forming in the minds of many. What kind of man walks into a place like this and carries something like that without showing it? And the older inmate did not answer right away, because the truth was not simple. Daniel reached his cell later that night and paused for just a moment before stepping inside, his hand resting briefly against the cold metal frame, his breathing still steady, unchanged, as if the entire day had been nothing more than another step in a path he had already chosen. The lights dimmed, the noise settled, and Redwood returned to its usual rhythm on the surface. But beneath that rhythm, something new had taken root, something quiet, something patient, something that would not fade with time, because the question was no longer what had happened in that cafeteria, but what would happen next, and whether the system built on control was ready for someone who had never been controlled at all.